President Trump today repeated that trade negotiations are underway with Chinese officials, despite China denying such negotiations taking place. To dive into this, we're joined by John Sitilides, geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors and former diplomacy consultant at the State Department. John Sitilides, thank you so much for joining us here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, China is saying that negotiations between the U.S. and the CCP are not occurring right now, and they said that in order for that to happen, the U.S. needs to drop some of its tariffs first. What kind of situation is the CCP in here? If they make the first move, does that make them lose face?
Well, let's keep in mind, first of all, that there's a difference, and maybe this is purely semantic, in how one approaches quote-unquote negotiations or dialogue. The Chinese tend to be, at least under the CCP, very formalistic, very methodical, and probably absolutely correct in their public pronouncements that there are no formal negotiations, no formal dialogue taking place. At the same time, Team Trump is saying that they're in constant contact, which they probably are, at a very low level. And so from Trump's perspective, it's taking advantage of every opportunity to see whether or not there is something that connects Washington and Beijing to then begin to formalize a process for negotiations, while Xi Jinping and his team are saying there's no dialogue and no negotiations taking place. So both can actually be accurate at the same time.
And on the other end of this is how long China's economy can hold out. We have Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent saying that China can move in the direction of from its overcapacity, overconsumption, overcapacity exports to helping its own domestic demand, and that the U.S. will help it do so. How is that likely to go over with the CCP?
That's going to be quite the challenge, I think, from Washington's perspective. China is, I think, in a position both to be able to absorb the blows, both economically and politically. And there's really not much talk about the political controls that an authoritarian regime like the Chinese Communist Party maintains over 1.3 billion Chinese citizens, which is an important part of this. I mean, Trump, to his disadvantage, is the president of a democracy. There are so many different inputs from voters, from lawmakers at various levels, from chief executives of major corporations, to lean on the White House to explain why these tariff negotiations, if they come into place, or the trade war overall, are very deleterious to these constituents and these stakeholders. You don't have that in China. There are methods for oppressing any dissent, minimizing dissent, whether it's police surveillance, whether it's a crackdown, a very harsh crackdown in those areas, especially by workers that are rebelling, where they are most affected by the U.S. tariffs. So I think they're able to minimize any type of political dissent in a way that simply a democratically elected leader cannot. And economically, the sense that I have is that the Chinese economy and Chinese society is hardwired for a greater pain threshold. They can endure more pain than, say, the average middle-class American consumer if we have a prolonged trade war.
And so we're seeing that China is over-subsidizing its exports. Do you think that Beijing has terms for diffusing this kind of conflict in terms of how its current system operates with an export-based system?
That's the $64,000 question, as we like to say. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, made very clear that there is a global trade disequilibrium from Washington's perspective, and that global trade and U.S. China trade specifically needs to be rebalanced. And there were greater protests now from the Trump administration about China's sort of industrial policy, very heavy subsidies of manufacturing and industry to provide for greater exports to global markets, rather than focusing on expanding the consumer market inside of China domestically and provide for greater balance so that we don't have all of these Chinese trade surpluses with every country or most countries around the world, but especially here in the United States. But China, I think, is very determined to rebalance or recalibrate its trade ties with the U.S. or any other country at its own choosing, its own timing. And again, I think they want to be very careful to not be perceived as caving in or capitulating to President Trump's demands or that of any of his secretaries.
Moving over to another issue here, China is saying that they're sending back Boeing jets, and Boeing's considering, their CEO's considering not doing business with China anymore, sending their airplanes over there. Trump posted on Truth Social this morning, quote, Boeing should default China for not taking the beautifully finished planes that China committed to purchase. This is just a small example of what China has done to the USA for years. And by the way, fentanyl continues to pour into our country from China through Mexico and Canada, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and it better stop now. Now, how does this fit into the larger picture of doing business with China? Could we see more companies leaving China?
Well, I think that's going to be the course of the U.S. China relationship one way or the other on high-risk industries. I don't know if aerospace necessarily fits in there, and I'm not privy to the internal discussions at Boeing, of course, but the question is going to be, to whom does Boeing sell the airplanes that China had contracted to purchase? I mean, they have very stiff competition from Airbus. That's a global trade competition, so I don't really know what the market is immediately for any excess airplanes that Boeing has to sell if the Chinese decide not to proceed with those contracts. But on the larger scale, if I might emphasize, I think there is going to be, or at least the effort is underway, to significantly de-risk the American economy from dependence on the Chinese economy for national defense, for advanced technology, for energy, for pharmaceuticals, for medical equipment. As we learned during the COVID lockdowns, we were so dependent on China for so many of the aspects of our national defense and our economic and societal well-being. And this is simply unsustainable when at the same time the Chinese military is preparing for a possible military showdown with the United States over Taiwan, over the Philippines, or the South China Sea. In what universe is a great power dependent on its primary military adversary for all of the aspects of societal well-being and national defense? So this has to change. And whether it's under President Trump's administration, whether it's conjoined to a successive administration or several, this may take 5, 10, 15 years. But I believe in those areas the de-risking is underway and will likely be a sustained policy, hopefully across Republican and Democratic administrations, while we're still buying perhaps T-shirts, electronics, furniture, things like that from China, which don't really have an impact on the essentials of national security and economic well-being.
John Sitilides, thank you very much for your insights here today.
Thanks again for having me.